And the other thing that it really sounds like as well is that what we think is that all of you deserve choice in housing. Whether you are renting or looking to buy, everybody deserves choice, whether for some people the solution is a tiny home and for others it's a place where they can have the whole whānau. So the other point, just briefly before we pass to Helen in terms of focusing on solutions, is we are now, instead of looking at this really narrow lens of the economy, starting to talk about well-being. And we know for a fact that when we are talking about something like housing, we are talking about one of the most fundamental points of security in somebody's life. And if somebody doesn't have that security of housing, how the hell are they supposed to build towards stability in their mental health? So if we want to address the mental health epidemic in this country, housing is a bloody good place to start. Now's the solution. You have 3 minutes.
Let's just take up that point about the engagement of people. And, you know, it's an appalling mess, right? We haven't been training apprentices, so it's very hard to build these houses. We have systems like, I think there are some really questionable issues around the super city, not because I don't think that there might be some efficiencies in it, but because the way it's been set up means it's disconnected. But it's like, it's got to the point where it's very, very hard to be influencing your own community. This is actually a really interesting opportunity for an island because you are such a defined community, I think. So you've got that kind of capacity to do that. And I think you also have a really creative group of people on the island. So you have this capacity to perhaps turn this disaster into something where you can build quite enlightened communities. I think Bill was talking about how at Living Waters he's part of a community. He doesn't have a very big house, but he actually belongs to a group of people. You know, I've got elderly parents. I'm worried about how lonely they are in their situation. I'm also worried about the quality of their house. You know, I have a brother who's sleeping in a shed, and that is because his marriage has broken up, and that's the only option. And so it's a very shared issue. And sorry, that's not a solution. The solution...
You've got a minute for the solution,
the solution, something like rental. Let's just go to rental. Rental, we've been in this weird ethos where basically we have had almost no rights for renters. And I was saying before at an earlier meeting, you know, I was really shocked in central Auckland where people are renting, like obviously no pets, washing that is inside because you can't put it out. That means that the house is damp. It means that you don't have the kind of connectivity that makes people well. But I think that the focus on Kiwi Build, in some ways, you know, the focus on rental is probably more important than ownership at this point. Not that I'm anti-ownership, because what we have to do here is an ethos change, where we're basically saying everybody has these rights. We're no longer apologetic about our rights just because we don't have a lot of capital. Because guess what? Most of us aren't going to, given this movement of capital.
When I was first elected in 2010, it was almost a dirty word to talk about housing from a council perspective, because whenever it came up, it would be like, oh no, that's government's problem. But we know for 9 years, the government didn't see it as a problem and didn't do anything. So there's this huge vacuum. And what I've seen just happen in the last couple of years with the change of government has been a real shift in terms of thinking that actually council working together with community, with government, with mana whenua can make a real difference and do things differently. So just to give a couple of examples in terms of homelessness has been a massive issue, Auckland-wide. And finally, there are whole lots of agencies coming together and putting money into Housing First, and council's actually come up with a $5 million grant for that project. So the money is there. So if on Waiheke there are good solutions that are identified, that money should be there, and it shouldn't be for Living Waters to be having issues with septic tanks and not being able to afford $100,000 to fix those septic tanks so that as many people can live there as possible, because the government, council should provide those solutions. So I'm really feeling that that having strong advocacy and empowering the community can really ensure that we can come up with the right solutions and fund them in terms of providing more housing, security for tenants, looking at how Housing New Zealand can come to the party, how we can maybe provide more semi-permanent housing for seasonal workers, the problems that Paul has talked about. I mean, council should not be blocking these good ideas and initiatives, and when I hear that I feel really embarrassed to be part of council, because we should be enabling, we should be saying, okay, you've got a great solution, community. Let's focus on what these solutions can be and let's work together to achieve them, and I will be your strong advocate to make that happen.
Picking up on the idea of empowering the community, I think that one of our issues on Waiheke is we start looking to other people for our solutions. We need to revive street meetings so we know who the neighbours are, we know who's living in the house next to us. More importantly, we know who's living in the car at the bottom of the street, and go and see those people and talk to them and have some fun and agree on some local issues, because then we can start talking street by street by street with a common voice and get some unity. We need to revive some of the traditions that promote common unity. Common unity is what community means. The trolley derby. I haven't been so proud of being on Waiheke for 10 years.
I know, yes.
Absolutely looking after one neighbour who needs help. That sounds stupidly unrealistic, but if we start there, we might actually start to have the power that we need for people to start listening to us. We need to re-engage with one another on the matters that interest you, and that's food, farming, walking, teaching kids to cook and grow food. That's really important on this island. We grow diddly squat here. Britain's about to go through Brexit. They don't realise that if they have a blockage in the Channel Tunnel, they run out of food in 3 days. There's no food warehousing in the whole of Britain. We've got a small problem on Waiheke and we can solve it locally. But if the ferries stop running, we run out of food. That's ridiculous. We do have to reverse the top-down bureaucratic-driven culture in the council. They've got to provide the helpful service that we're praying for and paying for. We used to get it until very recently, 10 years ago. Mark Inglis has moved 7 houses onto the island, and the way he moved them was to get round to talking to the council and getting the solutions. If he wanted a driveway across the neighbours, it was a 10-minute conversation and $250. It's cost us $20,000 in 15 months. And Auckland Transport don't visit the island. They do everything off Google Maps.
I know, it's bloody ridiculous.
Who are the actual owners? It's us. It's not them. If you give a bureaucrat room, he'll fill up the available space and take every bit of oxygen out of the room and ask for more money. That's what they do. We've got to relax the compliance regimes for sleep-outs and tiny houses. It's just a nonsense. This is a crisis. Anything that doesn't leak for 6 months is better than what we're living in. We've got to stop looking for trouble and start trusting Waiheke. I've talked to Claude quite a bit about this. Trusting Waiheke is going to become our new catchphrase. We've got to activate and facilitate multiple dwellings on larger sites with combined modern septic systems. I was saying to Helen before, it takes about 17 consents at the moment if you want to put more than one house on one property and then put a septic system in that serves somebody across the site boundary. It's absolutely nonsense. We've got to actively promote a wider range of dwelling types and non-invasive uses in residential neighbourhoods, rather than merely clipping the ticket on new houses and clipping the ticket on upgrades. There's so many people got their hand out waiting for our money, and they're not doing diddly squat to help the problem. With this island should be doing food farming. We've got to look at water retention, we've got to look at energy generation, we've got to look at storage facilities, and we've got to look at small workshops. All of those things are part of a community. And we're building houses, and the people who flop exhausted into them and then spend a weekend and have to go back and earn enough money to pay the bank, they're not the enemy. They're actually part of the problem. We've all got the same problem. It's not a lot to ask, really. Even a shoddy, cynical council this council was put together, I'm still not that optimistic it's going to change, because we've only got one lifetime. And this was set up to fail, this super city. It's achieved the exact opposite of everything Wellington promised. Auckland's been trumped.
I do believe that the solution has to come, there has to be subsidy, and that's what we've learned in the housing developments we're doing in Auckland, unless the government and or the council, but mostly the government, actually writes some fairly large cheques. In fact, we get a 50% cash subsidy from government on all the long-term social rentals that we are now building in Auckland. Without that, it is simply not possible for us to do that. And the rent that people pay is no more than a third of their total income. Most of our tenants in Auckland are people who have long-term mental illness. They're people who will be for their lifetime on the invalid's benefit. We also have a lot of single parents. So they're people who will never be able to afford market rent, but we as a housing provider, we are paid market rent by the government. But the person, the tenant, only pays up to the maximum of a third of their income on rent, and that is what the definition of affordable is. So this journey started in 2016 with the local board, who I want to acknowledge funded this work for Mark and I to do, because we wanted to answer the question, is it possible to get social housing on Waiheke Island, which is long-term affordable social rentals, that could access this 50% subsidy from government? So the first thing we needed to do was understand the size of the problem. Face-to-face with vulnerably housed people, and in early 2016, or actually it was late 2015, we identified 218 adults and 69 children on this island who were vulnerably housed. So they were living in either, they literally had no security of tenure. It didn't mean that they were living in cars, although some of them were. Some of them were camping at Whakaneifa. Some of them were knocking on Wiramu's door. Some of them were living on couches. And we wanted to understand who those people were. Interestingly, 29 of them were over the age of 65, and 32 were people who had children. So we had, again, the most vulnerable were the most vulnerable. There are some interesting statistics. We also pulled the census data from 2013 for Waiheke. And Waiheke has the second oldest population in Auckland behind Great Barrier Island, interestingly. So between 2006 and 2013, there was a 50% increase on the island of people over the age of 65. So what this showed us is that a real high needs population on the island for housing, and we've heard that with some of the stories tonight, are our very precious seniors who are in rental accommodation. And we then went and interviewed some of those people, and we heard stories continuing what we've heard tonight. One of them, for example, is, and this has been validated by research out of Auckland University, that we have seniors in very low standard rental accommodation who are too scared to complain to their landlord about the quality of that, because A, they don't want their rent to go up, or B, they don't want to be kicked out. And as those properties have become very valuable, that is a real possibility for them.
One of the things that happened last year was there was a one night everyone went out in Auckland to do a head count on homeless people, sort of stuff. And on Waiheke Island, we found 17 people in this area of living in their cars. And then we find out, after they got all the numbers back, South Auckland, Central, West Auckland, all this sort of stuff, that Waiheke Island had the most homeless people per head of capita. And you think, whoa, geez, what's going on here? you know. And it's sadly, you know, there's this sort of mindset that if you put South Auckland over here and you put Waiheke Island over here, and you go for some funding and or whatever, it's a Waiheke Island, South Auckland, let's look at that application over there sort of stuff, you know. Because there's a mindset that, hey man, everyone owns a boat here, everyone's got a $3 million house in the rich and famous little Waiheke Island. But there's another side of Waiheke Island too. And it's a side that we see on a daily basis sort of stuff. You know, Living Waters Church, you know, out of the Bible, there's a scripture that says, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. And when I was a stranger, you took me in. And on those two principles, that monarchy is what we developed the emergency accommodation program on. Even with the soup kitchen, because it's not the housing, there's a whole lot of different layers, you know, and a person comes to, they're depressed, they're suicidal, there's this and that and that. I remember a conversation that I had with an elderly woman, and she says, you know, this is my main meal for the week. You know, and the loneliness that a lot of our old people, you know. And so when we have the soup kitchen and we have the housing and things like that, the people come in, it's an opportunity where we can gather together and people can feel that, hey, listen, I'm not alone, you know. I can just sit here, I can have a coffee, I can chat, and I can enjoy myself. And if we can walk beside people on their different journeys, you know, we have people from all sorts of stuff, you know. We've got a young boy in youth justice right now that we're working with. We've got 2 people from our mental health sector that we have right now. We've got 2 people that are bailed to us from the courts right now, sort of stuff. And our elderly folks in whānau, you know, actually, you know, the first person that took in for emergency accommodation was my son. God, you know, I thought we had kicked him out and flew back into the nest, sort of stuff. But, you know, but after we had a woman that was living in Whakanefa, Māori woman, with 5 tamariki sleeping in her car in a station wagon. 5 tamariki in a station wagon in the middle of winter. And, you know, there's whānau out there that needs help. We're in a situation where if we can get resource consent, $100,000 to put the septic tank in, we can double the quota that we have to help people. We can have 20 to 25 people. We can get another 12 people that we can work with. I'd love to have another 12 people on the island to say, hey, listen, we can support you. You know?
So I think one of the most important things for me, so I work for Oranga Tamariki, and we are working right across the sector, and the cross-sector engagement is really important because what we know is that health, for example, the current Auckland District Health Board have got plans to actually look at housing in the future, and it's how can all of the agencies actually work together to come up with some solutions. Because I think if you're just looking at one organisation, if you're just looking at the local board in isolation, you actually need to look at all of the agencies that can contribute funding to this big significant issue, which covers health, which covers housing, which covers so many different issues for New Zealanders. So that's the really big thing for me, is to work in partnership. Partnership is key in terms of working with iwi. There's already a lot of examples, as I said earlier, that a lot of iwi have come up with across the country. But again, it's about iwi working with all of the organisations as well as the local community. The community actually have the answers, but it's about those views and those answers then being designed into actual plans to make it happen. Because what happens all the time is that we have all these great ideas that come up, but no one knows where to take them. No one knows who's the key contact people that we should be going through in terms of local government or in terms of the district health boards. But once you know, when you can have people that can actually broker those relationships, and look at things like memorandum of understandings and partnership agreements, then you can actually get some traction and move forward. So kia ora. Kia ora.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you so much for that. So I wrote down a lot of things. And I think the major theme is actually that the solutions aren't too hard. In terms of how they sound, they're quite straightforward and they're quite simple. What we actually just need is to get on with it. And I think that therein lies the problem. What are the barriers? The barriers appear to be broadly systemic, and when we're talking about things like council, I think that all of these systems are ultimately the sum of their parts. So if we're talking about the culture in these spaces, it's all of those people around the council table. When we're talking about the bureaucrats, it's it's the way that they've been trained. And as has been said, as has been said, it's currently not citizen focused. It's currently not about people. It's about box ticking. So just to run through a few different things, the first one that really came out of this around particularly renters, as Helen mentioned, is that it's actually really expensive to be poor. If you are having to move on a yearly basis, which I was up until about 2 years ago when I was elected, and I don't think it should take the people to be elected to have security of housing, is that, when you are bounced from place to place, prior to this government removing letting fees, you were consistently having to pay these different agents for the privilege of them allowing you into the house. And instead of the situation where the landlord, who is the person who is making money out of you renting the property, paying for that kind of process. We've also currently got movement underway in the Residential Tenancies Act to enforce renters' rights. And under the Kiwi Build Reset is $400 million in there towards a rent-to-buy scheme. So that is a sense of progressive ownership. And what happens there, just to explain it in a nutshell, is that those who cannot afford to come up with the money for a mortgage essentially rent a property, and a portion of that rent goes towards building up equity. And that is a really important pathway for those who cannot currently get on that path towards building a mortgage themselves or that capital. As everybody's highlighted, the most important solutions, the most enduring, the most sustainable solutions are community-driven. It doesn't make sense for bureaucrats in Wellington to tell you what's going to happen on Waiheke, because it simply becomes a matter of overlaying this blueprint of box checking, which doesn't actually work for the unique community that you have here, particularly for development that'll make sense for you. So this is where I think that council needs to actually be walking alongside you, and that there is the opportunity for the likes of consenting processes to be more streamlined, to actually focus on solutions as opposed to the process to get there, and trying to fit those round pegs in square holes. There's also the opportunity to build greater communities through stronger design. As so many people have highlighted, particularly our elderly feeling that sense of isolation as we all get older. And single parents, exactly. If we do build a greater sense of community through things like design, but also access to those communal spaces, things like food gardens and otherwise, then not only do we have climate-ready infrastructure, but we also all learn those really basic skills. Then there is Resource Management Act reforms, the good old RMA. Those are coming before Parliament in the next few months. I would encourage everybody to submit on that. There is also the issue of taxation. I noticed somebody on the board outside has put capital gains tax on there. There is one party in Parliament still advocating for it. But I would say that just on the point of capital gains, and this gets to Helen's point too, it's not actually typically someone's genius that results in this inflation of capital gain. It's actually the innovation and investment of the community around you. And it is the ratepayers and the taxpayers that have invested in that roading infrastructure and things like broadband and things like public transport that increase the value of one's property, which gets to the point of the most expensive component of building, if not the consents here, as it sounds, but it's often land. And I was talking to somebody in the audience earlier about how, yes, it was you, about how there are some really innovative solutions here, particularly with the likes of Papakainga housing, which we were talking about earlier, and that is that partnership with Māori and with iwi. And the final point is around the issue of emergency housing. I am astounded that there is no funding for the work that you guys do, Wiremu, from central government in terms of providing these beds. I am astounded. And that to me, in terms of talking about that disconnect between, people seeing South Auckland as a poor area, people seeing Waiheke as a rich area, I get really weary about us falling into a space where we put these two different areas into competition, because it shouldn't be. Instead, it should be about improving everybody's lot. And to get to the point, that was raised before, at a baseline, it's about seeing housing as a human right. And about ensuring that all of us have access to that fundamental security. So I think we've heard a lot of solutions, and hopefully you'll be voting for all of these amazing candidates who are, moving towards implementing them, like KAYLEE and Cathy. Thank you all so much, and just 3 tangible things that we can all take away from this discussion tonight, because we are actually looking for actions and solutions here. The first one, as raised by Paul, but also by Wiramu and actually everybody else, is just start talking to your neighbours. Start connecting, start unifying, and start civil dispute. The second one is to vote in your local body elections, but do more than vote. Turn up to the public debates, write letters or emails, or call up the people who are standing and ask them what they stand for and hold them accountable to it. Because democracy doesn't just happen every 3 years, it happens every day with the decisions that are made by the people who are elected to represent you. And the third one is that you're all going to form a brains trust to back Wiramu and what he's up to. Just a round of applause for everybody, and we'll pass back over to Cathy and KAYLEE. Kia ora.
Well, we've got a lot to think about. I think we know which direction we should be going in. And I think it was a fabulous panel. Thank you so much. Now, a very important moment.
Lucky person will be this one.
Laura West.
Congratulations, Laura. Deservedly so. Instigator of many groovy things. Nor you can't take the bucket.